During late 1921 and into 1922, the preeminent naval powers of the world came together in an effort to limit the building of ships, their sizes, and the amount each nation was allowed. The first interwar naval treaty, the Washington Naval Treaty, set strict limitations on tonnage for each of the signatories, where the tonnage limits were as follows: 5.5, 3, 1.75, and 1.75. Each of those nations was the United States, Britain, Japan, France, and Italy. Throughout the coming years, following on treaties such as the London Naval Treaties restricted construction further. Some powers such as Germany had other treaty restrictions like the Treaty of Versailles to take into consideration as well. In this environment, some navies coped with the restrictions better than others, and in some cases, navies produced terrible designs. In today's video, we'll cover 3 terrible interwar designs. Starting with the French heavy cruisers of the Duquesne class, which were interesting to say the least. In this case, to start out, we'll take a look at French cruisers 1922 to 1956 by Jean Moulin and John Jordan, where they write, "In agreeing qualitative limits for ships beneath the capital ship category, which stipulated a maximum displacement of 10,000 tons and a maximum caliber of 8 inches, 203 millimeters, the Washington Conference effectively created a new category which became known as the treaty cruiser. From this point onwards, all 5 of the major navies would consider any cruiser with lesser qualities to be an acknowledgement of material inferiority. To a certain extent, the design of the new ships was a step in the dark. Only the British with the Hawkins class, the French with the Duguay-Toulon class, and the Japanese Furataka class had suitable designs on the drawing board, which, if scaled up, would provide a suitable template for the treaty cruiser. The Americans, although supportive and partially responsible for the new qualitative limits, had only paper sketches, and the latest Italian cruisers were small, fast scouts. The role of the cruiser for the French, and quite frankly the rest of the world, was to protect trade and sea lines of communication, while threatening those of potential enemies. Those qualities continued to be vital for France, especially protecting trade to and from North Africa. A potential adversary in the Mediterranean was Italy, as by the time the treaty was signed, the two nations weren't on good terms, where I get to quote one of my favorite articles I've ever found for this channel. We will look at the Franco-Italian rivalry, current history, 1916 to 1940, volume 38, number 3 by B.Z. Goldberg from June of 1933, who opens up by saying, quote, "The immediate danger to the peace of Europe lies somewhere between Rome and the implacable Balkans, for Italy has dared to challenge French hegemony. Germany, despite all her potential might and menace, is but the background to the impending, possibly final struggle between Caesar and Gaul." Essentially, France's main rival in terms of naval combat was Italy. Anyway, with that in the background, staff requirements as early as July 6, 1922 were 8 203mm 8-inch guns, each with 150 rounds, and 3 or 4 lightly armored turrets, 4 100mm high-angle guns, each with 500 rounds, 2 quadruple 550mm torpedo tubes with 4 reserve torpedoes, 4 Thornycroft 24cm anti-submarine mortars, a range of 5,000 nautical miles at 15 knots. So with that, guns and speed were prioritized at the cost of armor. Initially, the General Staff was considering how they could adapt the Duguay-Toulon class to use 203mm guns, thinking that the increase in gun caliber would cover the increase from 8,000 tons to 10,000 tons. This was probably an underestimation by the General Staff. Even with the requirement for a larger hull strengthened to withstand the much greater stresses when firing bigger guns is put to one side, the weights involved were totally disproportionate. We're to take from French cruisers again. Each twin 203mm turret weighed 180 tons, whereas the much smaller 155mm turret fitted in the Duguay-Toulon class weighed only 30 tons. Each 203mm round comprised a shell weighing 123 kilograms with a 53 kilogram charge, whereas the 155mm shell weighed only 57 kilograms and was propelled by a 20 kilogram charge. The General Staff also wanted 150 rounds per gun, whereas in the Douai-Toulons, that figure was 125. Overall weights for the main artillery of these respective ships, including ammunition, were therefore approximately 930 tons versus 400 tons, an increase of 135%. So, not off to a great start with the design. There was additional weight added later, as in 1922, the General Staff wanted additional anti-aircraft guns, as well as having a seaplane for reconnaissance. In compensation for this, the quadruple torpedo launchers were made triple torpedo launchers. The weight savings from that were minimal. In a displacement-limited treaty design such as this, these could have been the straws that broke the camel's back, and soon we'll see why. Like I mentioned earlier, speed was a priority, but with the limited displacement, the designers were really struggling to find a way to fit the required machinery to achieve the 34-knot top speed the General Staff wanted. The initial designs had the ship at 200 tons over the Washington limit, and that simply wouldn't do. AC Bretagne came up with a shaft solution producing 115,000 CV for 34 knots at normal displacement based on 8 small tube boilers and 4 identical sets of turbines. With cruise turbines, only the inner shafts achieved the stipulated 5,000 nautical miles at 15 knots. Here are the particulars for the ships, and let me know if you see something that stands out. Hint hint, the protection. But anyway, some further modifications to the design occurred, specifically the anti-aircraft armament. But getting into the issue here, protection in the initial draft was broadly comparable to that of the Douai-Toulon class, with light compartmentalization and reinforced longitudinal bulkheads set 2 to 3 meters inboard of the outer hull to protect magazines and machineries. The STCN also had proposed providing 30 millimeters of splinter protection over the machinery spaces, but this was abandoned when the General Staff called for a general beefing up of protection. As part of this, the greater emphasis was placed on defending the magazines and steering gear, and the thickness of certain key transverse bulkheads was increased from 8 millimeters to 20 millimeters to help restrict flooding. There were also recommendations for a 2-knot decrease in speed to secure adequate protection for the ship's magazines and some protection for the machinery spaces, which were vulnerable to even destroyer shell fire. However, the General Staff, hearing that Italian cruisers would have a 34-knot top speed, decided that they needed it as well and vetoed the proposal. We'll hear about those Italian cruisers at the end of the video. I think this piece in French cruisers says it all. The total weight accorded to protection in the Duquesne and Tourville was 460 tons, a mere 4.5% of their displacement. Although this constituted an improvement on the Douai-Toulon class, it was a significantly lower figure than France's competitors managed. It was decided to order the first 2 units immediately as a counterweight to the Italian ships, but to keep protection under review for later units. 4.5% is insane. Comparable cruisers of that period ranged from 6 to 10% of total displacement, a far cry from that 4.5%. Before we continue, generally speaking, when it comes to their machinery and guns, the thing the General Staff wanted to focus on, the ships performed well in those categories. It's that armor was sacrificed, as we can see. Getting back to the construction of that armor, it was based on the longitudinal principle, and as with the previous class, the hull was tightly subdivided. The 16 main transverse bulkheads were continuous from keel to upper deck, and were watertight up to the main deck. Each of the 17 compartments had its own pumps and ventilation. The transverse bulkheads fore and aft of the engine rooms were reinforced to 20 millimeters by sheets of 60 kilogram steel in an effort to restrict flooding to 3 adjacent compartments in the event of torpedo or mine damage. The unit machinery arrangement with the alternating boiler rooms and engine rooms was adopted to further enhance the survivability of the ship. Even after a torpedo hit, this ensured that at least 2 boilers and 1 set of turbines would be available to get the ship home. Taking from French cruisers again, in the absence of armor that could resist the shells of opposing cruisers, these ships, like their immediate predecessors, relied on their high speed to keep them out of harm's way, and their tight underwater subdivision to contain any damage sustained and to ensure survivability. Nevertheless, There was some light splinter protection over their most vulnerable spaces to enable them to engage light flotilla craft with a degree of confidence. The magazines, which accounted for some 25% of the ship's length, had 30mm bulkheads of 60 kg steel on either side, with 20mm crowns and end bulkheads. Given that these protective boxes were well inboard and separated from the hull sides by a combination of voids and spaces filled with equipment, this protection should have been adequate to keep out splinters from destroyer shell bursting on the outer hull plating, generally 16 to 20 millimeters thick, or the upper deck 22 to 24 millimeters. The steering gear was covered by 17mm plates, and the gun houses and the conning tower had layered 30mm of protection, comprising two 15mm plates of high tensile steel riveted together. So, not exactly the most amount of protection over the ships. Sure, we could have talked about their predecessors because of their lighter armor, but I felt it was appropriate to discuss these since the increase in armor wasn't that great. The ships didn't get up to that much in their careers, and even if they did, it probably wouldn't have gone well. Moving on swiftly to not necessarily a treaty cruiser in the same sense as the previous ships. As Germany, although not invited to participate in the Washington Naval Treaty, the restrictions of the treaty were intended to be universal. But nonetheless, the K-class of light cruisers. Going back to just after World War I, and not quite before the High Seas Fleet scuttled itself, on April 16, 1919, the German Admiralty was instructed to create the Provisional Reichsmarine, and only several months later, the scuttling of the High Seas Fleet took place. Subsequently, any new German warship had to replace a ship condemned to scrap from a list of the most modern remaining after the scuttling. The German Navy was cut down drastically in fulfilling the Peace Treaty of Versailles. The Navy was restricted to a standing force of 15,000 men who crewed obsolete pre-dreadnoughts, and critical to our story, the Reichsmarine was allowed to have 6 light cruisers. These light cruisers were not allowed to displace more than 6,000 tons, and the armament was not to exceed 15 centimeters or 5.9 inches. When the existing cruisers of the Gazelle class had been in service for 20 years, they could be replaced by a new vessel. Of the new vessels built, Königsberg, Köln, and Karlsruhe of the K-class or Königsberg class were introduced in the late 1920s. Königsberg, the lead ship, entered service in 1929, representing something completely new to the German Navy. Although limited by the Treaty of Versailles, the class was armed with 9 5.9-inch guns and triple turrets and 4 triple torpedo launchers. The development of light cruisers for the Reichsmarine was pretty much immediate following their creation, with the development of the Emden, based on the plans for the Karlsruhe of the former Köln class from the old Imperial Navy, with provisions to allow for lessons and experiences drawn from the First World War. The Emden came under strict supervision from the Allied Control Commission, who refused to approve the initial 2 designs, resulting in 8 5.9-inch guns being placed in single gun houses. All of this to say that Emden followed mostly along the lines of the old Imperial cruisers, while the Königsberg class, who were designed under Chief Naval Architect Egrenberg in 1924/1925, were a fresh development for the German Navy. Following the proven system of longitudinal bulkheads, correspondingly, the ships were comprehensively subdivided into 16 watertight compartments, the hull being protected by light waterline armor. The armor of the cruisers was relatively standard for the time as regards light cruisers, being similar to the material used before the Great War for protected small cruisers. Still, it was improved through war experiences and new alloys, although some cuts in the armor had to be made to keep within limitations. Where things start to differ is in the arrangement of the weaponry and machinery. Starting with the weaponry, the ships carried 9 15cm, 5.9-inch guns and triple turrets, with the rear turrets offset, B to port and C to starboard, 4 triple torpedo tubes, along with various anti-aircraft guns. B and C turrets were arranged to enable them to traverse to fire much smoother over the ship in a pursuit. It can be seen as a good idea in theory, but in practice, the muzzle blast would damage the ship. These arrangements had never before been seen on any German vessel. While the machinery consisted of 6 oil-fired Schultz-Thornycroft double-ended water tube boilers and 4 boiler rooms, which provided steam for 2 turbines that drove 2 shafts. In addition, The vessels were equipped with a cruising diesel engine with turbines for the diesel. Using their full power, the ships could achieve 32 knots. The machinery again differed from previous German designs, namely Emden. Their engine rooms were uncomplicated and generally reliable. However, because of the limitations, the machinery took up half the 16 compartments, spreading it over a greater area than normal. Another change in these ships was the beam-to-length ratio, in layman's terms, the measurement of how slim a ship is, which in the Königsberg class was 11:1, having a long flat aftership with an inclined stern. This is an important aspect of the ship, which we will discuss in a minute. All of this fire-powered machinery had to fit onto a vessel that weighed ostensibly 6,000 tons. Because of that, weight-saving measures had to be undertaken. Namely, 85% of the hulls were welded, and light metals were used wherever possible. These efforts to save weight and keep the ships within treaty limitations resulted in the sides, decks, bulkheads, and frames of the three ships being rather thin. Fractures and tears occurred amidships when going through rough seas or when the guns were fired. These problems were not solved by the time the final two German light cruisers entered service, although it should be noted the cruisers represented a completely new type, something Germany had never built. I feel that it's worth quoting German light cruisers of World War II, Warships of the Kriegsmarine by Gerhard Koop and Klaus-Peter Schmolke. The five latter German light cruisers were children of their time, the result of what designers had found possible to engineer within the limitations of the Washington Agreement, and a vast improvement on Emden except as regards seaworthiness. The great weakness of the K cruisers, Königsberg, Köln, and Karlsruhe, was their light construction. The fault lay not with the designers, but in the restrictions of the Versailles Treaty. They go on to discuss how when it comes to the different military requirements of hitting power and ability to take punishment, great range, and long endurance at sea, they could not meet all of those requirements. Compromises needed to be made somewhere. Thus, the ships lacked robustness, coming to a head in rough seas when the weakness of their construction was shown. Several times, Köln's superstructure had to be reinforced, where welded seams failed at joints, especially on and around the funnels and the upper deck. These problems were universal in the Königsberg class. This lack of robustness, due in part to the weakness of the welding and the large length-to-beam ratio, meant the ships had speed restrictions in bad weather. If the weather was severe, they had to seek shelter as they ran the risk of capsizing. Due to the ships being in weather where this could have been a real possibility, they were confined to the North Sea and Baltic. Eventually, they were allowed to stray beyond home waters, with the ships heading to Spain, but were restricted to fine weather periods. If that was not bad enough, because of the stability issues, their fuel reserves were crucial to keeping them balanced, so much so that the forward and aft fuel bunkers had to be emptied first and that they could not fall below a certain point. It also meant frequent refueling, meaning that in wartime they could not operate beyond coastal waters, making them useless as commerce raiders. When designing ships, naval architects set aside a certain amount of weight as an allowance known as the Admiralty Reserve, to save weight for additions and changes. With the K-class cruisers, though, the architects pretty much had to build up to the 6,000-ton displacement limit, making it difficult to leave room for new weapons, new fire control systems, and aircraft catapults. When these were added, it increased the top weight of the ships and contributed heavily to their stability issues, and this is why they were forced to remove their aircraft catapults. As for the particulars of the Königsberg, since she and her sisters were so similar, she was laid down on April 12, 1926, launched on February 26, 1927, and commissioned on April 17, 1929. Having a design displacement of 6,000 tons, she came out around 300 tons over the limit, wherein she operated at closer to 7,700 tons. Her machinery consisted of 6 oil-fired double-ended water tube boilers, giving steam to 2 geared turbines, powering 2 screws, giving her a maximum output of around 68,200 shaft horsepower and a top speed of 32.1 knots, while her cruising diesel powered the cruising geared turbines, giving her a 10-knot cruising speed. As for her weaponry, she carried 9 15cm, 5.9-inch guns and 3 triple turrets, 1 forward and 2 aft, with B and C turrets aft. Just as a quick aside, German turrets are as follows: Anton, Bruno, Caesar, and Dora, just so we're clear. As for anti-aircraft guns, she was initially equipped with multiple 88mm guns, being further augmented by more 88mm guns, along with 37mm and 20mm guns in various mountings, not to mention the 4 triple torpedo tubes. As regards armor, she had an armored deck varying between 20 and 40mm, or 0.8 inches and 1.6 inches, a main belt of between 50 and 70mm, or 1.6 inches and 2.8 inches, while the citadel area had a thickness of 70mm, or 2.8 inches. Each turret face had between 20 and 30mm, or 0.8 inches and 1.2 inches, with barbettes varying between 30mm, or 1.2 inches, and the command tower varied between 30mm and 100mm, or 1.2 inches and 3.9 inches. It should be noted that Karlsruhe was the only one that was given a major refit due to the war, and saw some changes that made her better suited for operations than the other ships. It's interesting because the ships did travel to different ports and visit places around the world, even with the weakness of their construction. However, things did change in 1936 when Karlsruhe was caught in a storm in the Pacific, causing significant damage and eventually a refit. She found herself in the Pacific in March 1936, and as you see, the cruiser planned to sail from Batavia in the Dutch East Indies onto Hong Kong and several ports in Japan. However, on March 12th, the weather took a turn for the worse. We'll get back to that in a minute, but overall for these ships, they had somewhat similar careers, with the most notable event during the interwar period being the Karlsruhe almost being sunk while crossing the Pacific in March 1936, as she was rolling and yawing fiercely, pounding and groaning at the steams, seeming like she was going to burst apart. Eventually, one of the longitudinal frames buckled, others followed on March 19th. On the boat deck, a fissure stretched from one side of the hull to the other. Testing the ship's strength and their faith, the crew went west, heading for safety in the Aleutian Islands. The storm finally subsided on the 21st, and on the 23rd, they made it to Dutch Harbor, spending the next 5 days patching up with shipboard tools, and then heading on to San Diego, where with the help of the US Naval Base, they patched up the ship as best they could, creating quite the patch job with I-beams. Arriving back in Germany on June 19, 1936. As for their wartime service, both Königsberg and Karlsruhe were sunk whilst participating in Operation Weserübung, Königsberg by bombs and Karlsruhe by a torpedo from a submarine. Köln, on the other hand, had survived until the end of the war, being sunk in Wilhelmshaven and scrapped following the war. Since she was sunk on an even keel, with a little bit of effort, both B and C turrets were able to fire on advancing Allied troops, something I cover in my second video on the Death of the Kriegsmarine series. The near disaster to Karlsruhe led to her career terminating as a cadet training ship, and instead, she went to the docks for repairs and a scheduled refit. Changes to the ship included the erection of a deckhouse between the forefunnel and battle mast, between the catapult and the forefunnel, the enlargement of the deckhouse aft, and 88mm gun mounts. Running trials in September, after this work was complete, surprisingly she was able to be repaired following such extensive damage. Like almost every other German cruiser we have discussed, she'd participated in Spanish neutrality patrols, doing this on and off between 1936 and 1938, wherein in May 1938 she was decommissioned for a large refit. This was because of the poor experiences of the 3 Königsberg-class cruisers, particularly issues with their weak construction, poor stability, and near-fatal Pacific cruise for Karlsruhe. Koop and Schmolke write about the major alterations. The foretop was reduced from double to single story. The staff on the foretop was replaced by a mast, and the searchlight platform on the battle mast was raised. The after funnel was shortened, and slightly canted caps were fitted to both funnels. The derrick post with searchlight stations was unshipped, and searchlight platforms were erected abreast the funnels. A large bent arm crane was installed on the starboard side and a straight arm crane on the port side. A taller mainmast with long tripod legs was fitted. Twin 10.5cm weapons replaced the 8.8cm twin flaks, and a 10.5cm single was fitted on the aft superstructure deck. Anti-mine gear was also added, and they report that some sources claim the cruising diesel was removed, although unlikely as the post-refit blueprints show it in place. This was the only major refit that any of the vessels received due to the war, but were they really that bad of ships? Taking from Gordon Williamson in his book German Light Cruisers 1939 to 1945, he writes, "This class of cruisers, of which there were three, the Königsberg, Köln, and Karlsruhe, was classified as Spähkreuzer, literally reconnaissance or scouting cruiser. They were never intended to give serious battle to equivalent enemy warships, but rather to hit and run. Thus, 6 of their 9 15cm guns were mounted into 2 triple turrets facing aft, to give better chance of fending off pursuing enemy ships. In the K-class, the 2 aft turrets were also mounted off-center, allowing the stern turrets to traverse further around in the direction of the bow and be brought into action if the cruiser was pursuing a victim. The severe treaty restrictions under whose terms the K-class cruisers were built, and many weight-saving measures employed resulted in vessels that were rather weak structurally, as would be proven by the storm damage suffered by Karlsruhe during her 1936 cruise to the Pacific. In addition, the effective range without refueling was rather modest compared with ships such as the pocket battleships and heavy cruisers that were later built. The K-class were not really suitable for long-distance operational use, indeed being inferior to the older Emden in this respect, and in the event, after the outbreak of war, they were restricted to coastal duties. The weight-saving measures were certainly an issue when it came to structural integrity, forcing the Germans to restrict the cruising ranges and times of year when they could go out. Not only that, stability was an issue like I mentioned previously. Our final class is the Trento class of Italy. As we mentioned earlier, the Italians had a need for speed in their ships, leaving other parts of the class to be less than desirable. Following the Washington Naval Treaty, Italy looked to design and construct new treaty-compliant cruisers. Obviously looking to counter the French in the Mediterranean, they needed some way to do that, and turning to Italian heavy cruisers from Trento to Bolzano by Maurizio Brescia and Augusto de Toro, they write, "Since the end of the First World War, the Regia Marina identified France as its primary adversary and structured both its budget and war plans around that assumption. Financial constraints shaped the former, while the latter was driven by Italy's geopolitical position and its heavy dependence on maritime communications. At the same time, pre-war doctrines emphasizing decisive fleet action continued to influence naval thinking. Although shaken by the experience of the war, they had not entirely been discredited. This duality was clear in the thinking of vice admirals who succeeded one another as chiefs of the Navy during the interwar period. On one hand, ensuring the security of vital maritime communications in the Mediterranean, particularly in its central and eastern basins, was a primary concern. On the other hand, the possibility of a decisive clash between battle fleets could not be excluded, whether as a result of naval operations, attacks on trade, or attempts to counter an enemy amphibious threat. Under all of these scenarios, the Italian Navy required a corps of armored units supported by light, fast, and difficult-to-detect vessels, tasked with attritioning and wearing down the French battle fleet in order to offset its numerical superiority. So they needed fast, heavily armed vessels to meet the operational requirements of the Italian High Command. When it came to the Trento class, those vessels being Trento and Trieste were named for the 2 most important cities Italy gained after the First World War. In the final design, the standard displacement reached 10,500 tons, slightly over the prescribed limits. The design was drawn up in 1923 by this Italian man, who I'm putting up on screen now, who envisaged the class as 2 large cruisers armed with 8-inch guns and 4 twin turrets. The main battery was arranged with 2 turrets forward and 2 aft, with B and C turrets superfiring, all mounted along a long flush deck hull. In a first for Italian warship design, the ships were also fitted with a bulbous bow, reflecting the Navy's emphasis on high speed and modern hydrodynamic features. The hull was a flush deck type, and this made the whole construction rather massive, with a high freeboard and excessive height between decks, especially on the battery deck. But before we continue, I should show you the particulars as found in Mussolini's Navy, a reference guide to the Regia Marina by Maurizio Brescia. I'd like you to notice the particulars of the armor. Certainly nothing to write home about. Granted, others were worse, but still, the armor wasn't great. To take from Brescia and De Toro again, they write, on the whole, the protection, if not entirely pro forma, was very limited, since, in particular, 70 millimeters of armor could not much represent a defense against hypothetical 203 millimeter projectiles. Trento, Trieste, and Bolzano would therefore have to rely on greater speeds to avoid combat against similar enemy ships, and on the main caliber guns to engage smaller ships, which would normally have avoided combat in any case. With the illusory advantage of a few more knots of speed, much more valuable qualities were sacrificed, such as a protection and a more general sturdiness of construction. Among other things, the overall lightness of the hull and superstructure led to a serious vibration at speeds in the order of 24 knots, making range finding impossible at that speed and sometimes even at higher speeds. So the need for speed bled into the lightness of construction and lack of armor, which created even larger issues with the ship, specifically with the guns. The masts, due to those vibrations, had to be reinforced several times, making them pentapod masts. Quoting from Mussolini's Navy, a reference guide to the Regia Marina by Maurizio Brescia, the main fault in the main armament of the Trento class, as well as for all the heavy cruisers that followed, most light cruisers, and many classes of destroyer, was that the twin guns were mounted close together in a single cradle, which caused the shells to interfere with one another's trajectories in flight, which, coupled with the excessive muzzle velocity and inconsistent performance of the propellant charges, caused excessive salvo dispersion, a problem which plagued the Regia Marina's gunnery throughout the war. Once the outline design of the Trento class had been settled, it was essentially inevitable that the ships would be armed with the maximum caliber permitted by the Washington Naval Treaty, namely the 203mm 8-inch gun. Political pressure also dictated that the guns, mounts, fire control equipment, and ammunition be designed and manufactured domestically, leading to the adoption of the Ansaldo 203mm 53 caliber Model 1924 gun in a twin turret mounting. From the outset, however, this weapon system represented a series of compromises. The use of built-up guns with fixed liners and a single cradle turret arrangement was chosen primarily to save weight, rather than to optimize performance or reliability. While this helped keep the design within treaty displacement limits, it had serious operational consequences. The single cradle mounting meant that the two barrels of each turret were mechanically linked, exacerbating dispersion problems and making accurate salvo fire difficult, particularly at long range. The gun's high muzzle velocity, intended to improve penetration, further worsened these issues by increasing barrel wear and shell dispersion. In practice, the combination of structural flexibility in the ship, turret mechanical complexity, and excessive dispersion resulted in a main battery that often failed to deliver consistent or effective fire. Even under ideal conditions, accurate range finding and fire control were difficult, and at high speeds, the very regime in which the Trento class was supposed to fight, effective gunnery became problematic or impossible. In short, while the Trento class was armed with the largest and most powerful guns allowed by the treaty, the emphasis on weight savings and speed meant that these weapons never fully realized their theoretical potential. The result was a main armament that looked impressive on paper, but which, in service, suffered from poor accuracy, rapid wear, and limited practical effectiveness. Another example of how treaty constraints and design priorities undermined the combat performance. So the ships were lightly constructed, lacked armor, and had difficulty hitting their targets. I should mention Bolzano, their half-sister, who was a bit better, but not by much. They did have their high speed, though, a 35.6 knot top speed on trials at around 11,250 tons displacement. Not bad for a ship of such size. Now, the Italian cruisers did participate in numerous engagements over the course of the Second World War, where both were sunk, with Trento actually being lost and Trieste being sunk and then scrapped, while Bolzano was sunk by a British submarine and then scrapped later on. There you have it, folks, some rather interesting and bad ships. Sure, some of the ships performed okay in their duties, but I don't think anyone is going to be defending their faults, unless we have some serious contrarians in the comments. If you'd like to see some more videos like this, let me know down below. Thank you all for watching, and please remember to like and subscribe, as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have a great week.